short episode on telescope focal ratio and picking telescopes on episode 346 of the Actual Astronomy Podcast. I'm Chris, and joining me is Shane. We are amateur astronomers who love looking at the night sky, and this podcast is for anybody else who likes going out under the stars. We got a couple Patreon supporters to thank this morning, Shane, so maybe we should just start there.
Yeah, we do. Thank you, Felipe and Kent. Those two are our newest Patreon supporters, so we always appreciate it, and we always like to say thanks to all of our Patreon supporters. It helps keep the show going, so thank you.
Thanks so much. And did you get any observing or observations in, or any recent new astronomical purchases since, I guess it's been a couple weeks since we recorded. I think the last time we recorded was on whenever it was, 2 weeks ago.
It's been a little while. Lots of solar observing. There's, I saw an article. I didn't actually read it. I just saw the headline that I believe there's a record number of sunspots, or maybe it's just through this current solar cycle. I'm not 100% sure, but the solar activity is just outstanding. So, I think I said this the last time we recorded, just, if you have the means to do any solar observing, you really should, because there's a lot going on there. So I've been getting out quite a few times during the day. And, sort of the usual story, lots of prominences, lots of surface detail. It's always changing and evolving, and a lot of fun. Regarding purchases, I was not in the market for anything at all, but I stumbled across an article on Astromart. There's a person that had some Zeiss Abbey orthos, and I think the person might have been open to selling, but was looking more for trades and was interested in some TMB super monocentrics or the Pentax SMC orthos. So the focal ratio, or the focal lengths that he had for the Zeiss Abbey orthos, were the 4mm, 6, and 16. So the 16 is the one that really was of interest to me.
That one is of great interest to me.
Yeah. So I sent him an email and I said, hey, I'm very interested in the 16. One of the Pentax SMC orthos he was looking for is the 9mm. I happen to have two sets of these because of bino viewing. So I thought I'm okay to give up the 9mm in exchange. I have two 8mm TMB super monos, so I'm kind of covered off really from a bino viewing perspective. So anyway, I sent him the email, and he said, sorry, somebody already spoke for the 16mm. So no worries. I thought, whatever, I will keep moving in the direction I'm moving. And then a couple days later, this person emailed me and said the deal that he was working for the 16mm fell through. Was I still interested? So I said, absolutely. So I sent him the Pentax SMC ortho and a little bit of cash, and then the Zeiss 16mm is on its way, and it's arriving tomorrow. So I'm very excited for that. And I've always been super curious about looking through a Zeiss Abbey ortho. I've never done that. So very interested. The kind of, maybe if there's a downside to this, is I don't really have another minimal glass eyepiece at 16mm to compare it to. The TMB super monos, the closest I have would be the 18mm. And then the Pentax SMC ortho goes from 12 to 18. And that's kind of it in my collection for the little, like the simple glass eyepieces. So won't be able to do a direct comparison, but regardless, I can't wait to look through it. It's the Zeiss Abbey ortho first series, the ones, not the twos. So there is a little bit of a difference there. The ones have a slightly wider field of view. The twos slightly less, but apparently that's because the ones didn't perform as well in telescopes that were fast, like f5 and faster.
Okay, but you've got an f8, so
yeah, I'm not too worried about it. Yeah. And anyway, the ones get very good reviews, as do the twos. They're, I don't think you're going to want for another eyepiece if you're, if you have a collection of Zeiss Abbey orthos. So
what's the field of view then?
45 or something like that, right around in that range, plus or minus 1 or 2 degrees. Typical ortho field of view.
Yeah. Okay. I'd love to look through that sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll bring it to Grasslands. We'll be there, I think, at the same time here, July 15th. Yep. So in the West Block, I'll certainly have it there.
Cool. Sounds
good. How about you? I know you've got some building news, and I don't know if you bought anything or if that's been all of your attention.
Oh, that's been all the attention. Yeah, this observatory building. Yeah, it's taken up a lot of time and contemplation. So,
well, it's been fascinating to see the pictures. As it's being developed here with floors and walls, and it's really starting to look like a building.
Yeah, floors, and we put post in. A little bit concerned about there's a little bit of vibration in the post, but I won't really be able to check it until we get a roof on it. Won't be getting a roof on it until probably end of next week, and then we're going to start on getting the post adapted for the mount and all that kind of stuff. So there's a few steps there. I'm a little nervous. It might be okay, but anyway, might have to do some jigging to really get it stable, just because of a couple things that sort of played out. And then the gantry work, the part, sort of like the scaffolding part that the roll-off rolls onto, that's about 2/3 done. So should be finished that next week for sure. And then, it'll be like windows and doors and stuff like that. So put a little drop down on it, just a very small one, so that I think if I can work out the height of the telescope correctly, and it depends on a few things. I set up in there already one night, and I could get Messier 7. I could get down to about negative 36 degrees declination from inside the observatory with the flap rolled down or flip down, or however it's going to work. And then, so fingers crossed that that works. But I might in the end up having to lose another 5 or 6 degrees just for the sake of future upgradability and a little bit more stability and stuff like that. So kind of playing there. So in that light, I'm going to actually be chatting with Mark Radici later on today. He's sending me some photos. He's just sending me some right now on taking some measurements for me, because if I get another scope, probably be like a used C11 like he went with. I have the same mount as him. And so it's going to have, I would expect virtually the identical measurements as his. So I just want to figure out how high he went and how much space he's left between the top of his scope and his roll-off roof, so that I make sure that I can get the roof off the darn thing when I need to.
Yeah, that's important. Well, that's great. I'm excited to see this thing get to completion, and it'll be a dream, I think, once you start using it.
Yeah, hopefully. There's a few things. Some of the stuff is working out really well, and some of it is, like I said, a bit of a question mark, some uncertainty. So one of them is that it can be very hot here, to say the least, and that hillside is a desert. I mean, it's a microclimate-ish, maybe not even a microclimate. It is a hillside covered in cactus, and it's very hot there. So it can be a couple degrees warmer up there even than where I'm sitting. And because of that, it had to be designed around airflow. And that part we worked that out. That part's been built, and the airflow is working perfectly. So I think we can keep it cool. That was like one of the main design principles. But in doing so, we had to kind of hang it a bit over the hillside so that the air would flow around it. And that meant that the post had to be a little bit higher. And then we had to go with a slightly longer post in order to make sure that we had enough room. And then we're going to have to cut it down. So I think once we cut it down and I put some weight on it, hopefully that kind of takes out the little bit of vibration. But I don't know if it would have much more vibration than like my tripod would anyway. I was just hoping to have a little bit more stability than what my tripod currently does. But we'll just have to see. Just have to see how it plays out in the end.
Yeah, right on.
Mark actually wrote a little bit of email, actually a little bit on solar observing. He wrote, I hope this message finds you well. A belated happy Canada Day to you both. And he said, I enjoyed listening to your recent podcast about solar observing with the long summer days here in southern England. My scope, a lens 60 millimeter, has been getting a lot of use. If I'm working from home, I can have the scope set up with the camera cable reaching into my observatory warm room that I use for an office. In fact, while I'm solar observing, it really should be the cool room as I'm avoiding baking in the sun. I can then make my calls, write my reports, and attend meetings, all while watching solar activity. I try and make a whole disk image when the clouds allow, and on rare occasions, the sky is completely clear. I've made some time lapses showing material flowing along the energy lines in the prominences. Absolutely amazing when you play back images in the video, and he sent us a couple links that are through to his Refreshing Views YouTube channel. Did you get a chance to take a look at these? These things are fantastic.
Yeah, they're incredible. Thanks for sending those, Mark. And really nice work. It just does such a great job to show what you can see with hydrogen alpha.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks for the note, Mark. Appreciate it. And I am actually going to talk with Mark in about an hour and a half because he's helping me do some measuring and finagling for my observatory, because I have the same mount that Mark has, and I may upgrade telescopes in the future, and just want to make sure if I do, I'll have enough room. Now for our chat on focal ratio, we had an email from Jesse on selecting a telescope, and in particular, selecting a telescope with a focus around focal ratio. So first, maybe we should just say what focal ratio is exactly and how it's determined. Shane, it's a fairly simple calculation, I think.
Yeah. So you take your telescope aperture, and you divide it by the sorry, I'm got that backwards. You take the focal length and you divide it by the aperture to get your focal ratio.
Yeah, and then that's just like expressed as a singular digit, so it's not like 1:8 or 1/8 or anything like that. If you have 100 millimeter telescope and it's an 800 millimeter focal length, like Shane's scope, then you divide the 800 by the 100, and that gives you 8, or expressed as a focal ratio, they might say f8 or whatever. So with that in mind, Shane, maybe I'll just read the first part, or I just read an email. Maybe you can read the first part,
sure.
And then we can,
So hello, Chris and Shane. Bear with me, as this is going to be a pretty long email, which contains two main questions. One to do with focal ratio in visual astronomy, and the other to do with the contrast difference while using refractors. I've been listening to your podcast for about 1 year now, and I haven't listened to every episode. I've gone through most of them. I have been interested in space for as long as I can remember, and at the end of 2021, I developed an interest in astrophotography after stumbling across Nico Carver of Nebula Photos on YouTube. I began by imaging the moon with a point-and-shoot camera and soon developed the bug. Now I have a fancy go-to mount, Newtonian telescope, autoguider, and lots of shiny toys. Well, recently, I developed a strong interest in visual astronomy and enjoy sketching at the eyepiece. Most of the time, I use my trusty Orion short tube 80 refractor on a cheap alt-az mount because I'm too lazy to disassemble the imaging rig, and had the thought in my head that I would like to image and observe in the same night, but have recently come to realize that I don't like fighting the computers and electronics and then observing at the same time. It is just simply too much for me to think about. On that note, I've been thinking about buying a new telescope that I would use for visual use only, and I'm trying to understand some things.
Yeah, so he's looking for a new scope, and goes on to ask a few questions about that. So one is, he says that and the reason why I wanted you to read that first part, I want to read this part, is I'm not an astrophotographer. So he says in astrophotography, you want the fastest optics you can get that are well corrected. So in focal ratio, Shane, what is fast versus slow? Like what does this mean here?
Well, yeah, so fast would be like a real short focal length. Slow would be a long focal length. Now, with telescopes for visual observing, a fast, at least in my opinion, a fast telescope is probably anything under f6.
Yeah.
Now, I would consider sort of f6 to maybe f8 or 9 to be medium, and then probably anything higher than an f9 to probably be a slower focal ratio.
Yeah, that sounds about fair.
Yeah.
He goes on to say, but while doing my research for visual telescopes, I am reading from people that F ratio does not matter almost at all, and that what I want is the telescope with the largest aperture. I admit that I have 4 telescopes already and should probably do some side-by-side comparisons, as they are of different optical designs. I will still do that testing before buying anything, setting them all at the same time, looking at the same object or objects. But I would like to hear your input on whether focal ratio makes much of a difference for visual use. So it's sort of an interesting question, Shane. I thought you had a pretty good reply, and maybe just if you can sort of share your thoughts on that to start.
Yeah. So there's a few factors here with focal ratio and visual usage. I can't remember exactly what order I went in, so if I missed something here, Chris, just throw it into the conversation. But typically with a longer focal length, you're going to have the opportunity to use more magnification. Magnification formula is focal length of your telescope divided by the focal length of your eyepiece. So the longer your telescope focal length, the higher your magnification will be, or at least your potential will be on that telescope. So planetary observers tend to favor longer focal lengths because on the planets, you can use as much magnification as the atmosphere will allow usually. And longer focal lengths just help you do that. So that's one benefit of a longer focal length. Maybe another benefit is that it's a little easier on eyepieces. Some eyepieces are not corrected for fast optics, and fast optics put a lot of, I would call it sort of stress on an eyepiece. And what that means is, some eyepieces in fast telescopes will show aberrations, particularly towards the edge of the field of view. Longer telescopes are just more forgiving. The eyepieces will work better because the light cone isn't as sharp going into them. So that's another advantage of the longer focal lengths. Something I didn't mention in the email that just came to mind is depth of focus. Some people talk about with longer focal lengths, you don't really even need a fine focus, a wheel on your focuser, because the depth of focus is quite large and it allows you to just fine tune or dial in the perfect focus. So that one's a little bit more controversial, I'd say. Some people agree, some people don't. But moving on to maybe faster optics or shorter focal lengths, a couple advantages. The first one is maybe mounting. A shorter telescope is just easier to mount. You have a shorter moment arm, so it's less subject to vibration, and you don't need as robust of a mount. The other, though, is for wide field use. If you want wider field of views, you go with shorter focal lengths. And that's probably one of the biggest benefits, I guess, of a fast telescope. Did I miss anything, Chris, or did you have anything else that you wanted to add?
No, I don't think so. Do you want to read part 3 there and then?
Sure. So, now on to the refractories question. The first question was actually spurred by this. I've been thinking about replacing my 90 millimeter f10 achromat with 120 millimeter f8.3 achromat. And someone mentioned to me that I should also look at some of the 120 f5 achromats out there, as they have the same light grasp. I hear these are both good instruments, and chromatic aberration does not bother me for visual use, as I'm usually looking at galaxies or nebulae. This line of thinking came after I realized that I simply do not have room to house an 8-inch Dobsonian, but the refractor could be stored in the same spot as the 90 millimeter if I sell that one. I've also heard that refractors have superior contrast, which I believe I have experienced for myself while using my Orion ST80 to view the Andromeda Galaxy and being able to see some dust lanes, while I was unable to do this with my 130 millimeter Newtonian. However, that Newt has a huge secondary mirror because it is designed for imaging, not visual use, so that could also have a hand in that as well, as being on different nights. So the seeing may have been different. To make this question shorter, could you give your opinions on the contrast benefits of a refractor versus a reflector? And for the sake of argument, if I were to have a 120 millimeter f5 refractor and compare that to my 130 millimeter f5 Newtonian, would I notice much of a difference? Thanks in advance if you even take the time to read all of this.
which we both did, and we both replied. It was,
yeah.
I think this is a very good email, and lots of really great questions here. And I've sort of been down the same path myself. So there's a few telescopes in play here. ST80, which is roughly a 3-inch f5 achromat, meaning that it doesn't focus all colors to the same point. So it means that if you look at the moon, you're going to see a bit of a color fringe, might be purple or a little bit green. My ST80 has a green one. My first one had a violet one. And like on Jupiter, we'll have a big violet halo. But on deep sky, you're unlikely to notice that color fringing. The other scope that he has in hand is a 90 millimeter f10, which, for lack of a better word, while achromatic, it is going to not have, or it's not going to have as much of this secondary spectrum color because it has a much longer focal ratio. And so the focal ratio on a refractor really comes into play with how much of this secondary color you'll get with an achromat. And the best way to visualize this is look up what's called I think it's called a Conradi chart or Conradi chart. It's one or the other, and it will detail it out. But this is another ratio just to confuse things. And what you do here is you simply take your aperture and divide it by your focal ratio, and you divide it by your aperture. That is. So I think the way it works is you would divide, for example, with the ST80, 5 by 3, and that's going to give you like 1.66 for your CR number. And so that gives you an idea of how much color. If the number for the new scope is going to be below that, it's going to have much more secondary color. And if the number is higher than that, it should theoretically have less color. So for example, with the 90 millimeter f10, that's going to have a CR number closer to around about 3 or so versus the ST80, which is going to have like about 1.66 or about roughly twice the color-ish. Of course, things will vary and everybody's eyes are different. So in comparing those two instruments, Jesse should be able to get a pretty good idea of how secondary color is impacted by telescope focal ratio. Now, the two telescopes that he mentioned, 120 millimeter, roughly a 5-inch or 4.7 inch f5, and 120 millimeter f8.3. The 120 millimeter f8.3 has virtually the same CR number or secondary spectrum rating as an ST80, but the 4.7 inch or 120 millimeter f5 it's going to be much higher. So that's basically going to have a 1, or it's going to have, I think like 66% or something like that, more secondary color than the original scope. So if you're fine with the ST80 and you're saying you don't mind secondary color and using mostly low power, then that can be fine. And everybody has a different tolerance to that. But I'm just curious, Shane, what are your thoughts on secondary color and how you perceive it, and maybe the impacts that you might want to draw attention to for this comparison?
Well, yeah. So it for me, it often shows up as like a yellow fringe when I've noticed it. It usually doesn't bother me because it's typically on the outside of the object. So if I'm looking at the moon, it it sort of encases the outer limb of the moon, and my approach is just to look at the craters, not kind of at the edge, and I'm usually okay. So for me, it's not a huge detractor, but I'll also be candid and say I haven't really done a ton of planetary observing with shorter focal length achromats. The achromats that I have are all what we would call quite slow. Like one is I think close to f17, my 76 millimeter. So 76 millimeter aperture Tasco with a 1200 millimeter focal length. So it's quite long.
Yeah.
My other one is my Zeiss telemeter. It's 63 millimeters or 64 millimeter aperture with a focal length of around 800. So, again, it's a slow telescope. So it really minimizes the amount of chromatic aberration that you see.
And they're not all like, if everything was created equal, it would be sort of an easier question to answer. But a mass-produced achromatic telescope with lenses in a plastic cell is going to perform very different than one of these sort of vintage, smaller, very long focal ratio instruments with Japanese optics in maybe cells that you can align like you have. Or I remember I was at a star party once and I was observing with Ron Ravenberg, and he had a 4-inch, like an F12 or an F15 or something like that. And even though we were looking at Jupiter and we could see the secondary color for sure, it had this violet halo to it a bit, but the image was absolutely stunningly crisp. And sure, you could see the secondary color. It was absolutely apparent, but we could use very high power. It had very crisp optics. And that's kind of one of my other points with some of these faster, more affordable instruments, is that you just might not be able to use as much power. So for example, in my SD80s, and I had two during the pandemic, one I gifted to my nephews and one I still have. And I did play around quite a bit with how much power they would hold. And, once you got more than about 1x per millimeter, about 80 power, things got really soft, regardless of whether I was looking at a planet or a deep sky object. Sometimes I think that's something that does get lost in the mix, is that it's not just the secondary color, and that can cause a reduction in contrast, although again, everybody is a little bit different. But also, if the optics aren't really well made, and it is very difficult to make very fast optics anyway, it's even more difficult to make really fast refractor optics, then you're going to have a challenge with how sharp things appear. So for me personally, Shane, I have reasonably fast apochromatic telescopes. I was using my F6 5-inch the other night as I was sort of trying to do some testing in the observatory that's getting built. And with that instrument, I'm pretty comfortable to go up to like 180 power. So basically, I'm 1.5 times my aperture in millimeters is pretty comfortable for that telescope. And I like to use that. Like if I'm looking at a globular cluster or something, even though it's not something that would show secondary color, that telescope will do it. And I enjoy using those higher powers for looking at planetary nebulae or anything of that description. Now, for large, wide field objects, again, I do find a benefit in the higher quality optics, because it's also difficult to make inexpensive achromats with a flat field. And that's one thing I noticed with my inexpensive achromats that I've recently had and ones that I've looked through at star parties, is that there's a lot more, for whatever reason, field curvature or other optical errors that seem to creep in, and requiring smaller field optics to be used, Plossels maybe versus Naglers and stuff like that, because they're just going to show that. I noticed that with my 80 millimeter f5 is that I just can't use as wide optics because they do get really, really soft on the edges, versus with like my Takahashi f5.9, which really isn't that different from an 80 millimeter f5 as far as focal length goes. It's only 45 millimeters difference. I can get beautifully sharp to the edge in the 60 millimeter Takahashi, but in an f5, my f5 achromat that I paid $30 for, no surprise that you're just not getting that sharpness. So Shane, for me anyway, there's a lot of trade-offs when one is picking like these particular instruments anyway.
For sure. And it really comes down to personal preference and how your eyes work, and a little bit of what you like to observe as well. For me, I I prefer a bit of a mid-range focal length to give me as crisp a view as possible to the edge. So as such, a lot of my telescopes are in that f7 to f9 range.
Mm-hmm. He also mentioned 130 millimeter f5, and that's a great comparison. In fact, I've compared my 125 millimeter refractor to the 130 millimeter f5. And my friend Tim had one that he had heavily modified to like perfection to get that 130 millimeter as good as it could possibly be. And the challenge with that size of a reflector is that it works great. You can get the wide field of views. In fact, I almost would prefer that over an achromat in these kind of sizes, with the exception that you have to have a pretty decent sized secondary. And I think Jesse mentioned that as well, in order just to get enough of a light cone to use reasonably wide field eyepieces, whether it's a 32 millimeter 1.25 plus, or you're trying to use some sort of 2-inch eyepiece in there, just because of the nature of eyepieces, not necessarily the telescope. The ratio of the size of that secondary has to be pretty big versus the mirror itself. If you go up to like a 6-inch f5, you'll actually find that the secondary size only goes up like a microscopic amount. They might even use the same secondary mirrors in a standard 6-inch f5 that they would for a 5-inch. And that would be my recommendation, would be to try to find something in that realm. And I think they're even making lots of these 6-inch or 150 millimeter f6s in some sort of visual configuration these days. And that could be a pretty good alternative as well, because then you have a telescope that should be able to both look at planets and handle wide field. And I think you'd be into that same sort of level of light grasp as the refractors in that case. But I've run mine against 130 millimeter f5 reflector, and the difference is quite apparent. The 100 millimeter or 130 millimeter f5 will look more or less, it will give you the light grasp of about a 90 or a 95 millimeter refractor. So the difference is apparent. It's not like world changing, but it is quite apparent. But I think if you went to like an f6 150 millimeter, then that comparison is going to be pretty hair splitting. Not sure if you have any thoughts on that one, Shane.
Totally agree. Yeah. Definitely notice a difference between the 130 and the 120. But like, also to your point, it's not going to necessarily be, changing your life. But you'll see some fainter things. Some faint things that maybe are a challenge in the 130 will be very easy in the 120. Where you'll probably notice it more is on deep sky objects, galaxies, some globular clusters, and some nebulae too. Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on a recommendation here for Jesse, or for people that are sort of making this kind of comparison? Like, personally, I want to have more power than what these telescopes could go. He's somebody who's already owned a lot of telescopes. Personally, my recommendation would be not to get too hung up on buying a particular telescope at a particular price. And what I mean by that is maybe either give this some serious thought and consideration. I think he's owned 4 or 5 instruments already. And my recommendation would be to either maybe save up a little bit more money and explore some alternatives in the new market, or B, start looking and seeing what's available on the used market, because there's so many wonderful instruments out there from years gone by, especially with the advent of astrophotography. A lot of people simply dump their old amazing equipment. But I didn't know what your thoughts were, Shane.
Yeah, that's sound advice for sure. I certainly don't mind the 120 f8.3. I don't think I would do the f5. Again, I mentioned earlier, I do prefer a little bit of a slower optic to increase the quality of the view. And one of the key things here, and we've already mentioned this a few times, is it really depends, excuse me, on the individual. And at the end of the day, the best way to find out is just to experiment. If you can find some other telescopes like what you're considering. If you can find somebody that has them and look through them just to see if they'll meet your needs, that's a good way to go as well. But I don't think there's really a wrong choice here. If you try something and you don't like it, you can sell it or trade it and move on and try something else.
One of the challenges that I found with these lesser expensive models, and there's nothing wrong with them. They're totally fine. You just need to be aware of what you're getting into. And I guess, like, if it was a brand new person who was just buying a first telescope, my advice would be different than somebody like Jesse, who has already owned 4 or 5 instruments and has done astrophotography and has done, sounds like, a significant amount of visual observing as well. So for me, like, this is a very particular answer for a very particular person, because I feel like, and just explore this, Jesse, and I may not have said this in my email back to you, but just think about what you're looking for with the new telescope, because a lot of the time we are looking to improve some other things. And even though at the present time you might be satisfied with those lower power views, or you're not observing planets as much, you could just end up owning another instrument. And there are some pretty good achromats that are being produced that are kind of sort of like in this sort of weird kind of mid-tier. I'm really curious about them. I might even get curious enough to buy one at some point. But Shane, like, you and I have talked about some of these. They're not quite semi-apochromatic, but they're kind of well-tuned achromats that aren't quite as fast as like f5. But I think there's some like 6-inch f5.9, 6-inch f6.5 that have been, I guess, engineered to handle the large wide field eyepieces that you're going to want to stick in those instruments. They have larger, more robust focusers. They have a slightly longer focal ratio. So, with some filtering and with the slightly more expensive coatings they're putting on these instruments, slightly better cells, the telescopes, and really not having experimented with them too much myself, you're probably just buying a telescope that's going to have a little bit more longevity. The issue becomes with the lesser expensive scopes, once you're further along, like Jesse is, that you want to make sure what you're buying is going to last you for a little while. Yeah,
no, that's good advice.
All right, that's sort of my 2 bits on it. It is something I've personally thought quite a bit about. In fact, I've almost bought like used. I think for me, if I was going to do it, I would just go all in. Like, if you're going to get one of these achromats that's fast, just go. And lots of people buy the 6-inch version that's f5. I would just go right to that, because then you're just getting the biggest sort of inexpensive achromat, and you've got something that can handle the wide field, and then maybe you can tweak it and go with that, or maybe save up a few pennies and look at some of these newer designs with more robust focusers that have slightly better correction and slightly better coatings to maybe get those higher powers like I would want, or save up a few bucks and start exploring the used market. There's so many great older scopes that are out there, Shane.
I'm a huge fan of, used gear, because it's already depreciated. It's one of the best ways to try something new, because if you don't like it, again, you can sell it, but you're probably not losing any money. So it's a really good way to go.
Yeah. Anyway, sort of a neat thing. If you were going to buy another telescope, Shane, what would you buy, or are you good?
I've still got like aperture fever in the back of my mind. My biggest telescope right now is 102 millimeters. So, I've been kicking around 150 millimeter apochromat for a while now. So that's a possibility.
Yeah.
There's some of the larger binoscopes that are kind of interesting. And then there's a little bit of me that says, something like an 18 to 20 inch fast reflector would be great.
Yeah.
With all of the telescope builders that we've had on the show lately, building these ultra fast, ultra big daubs. I'm kind of loving that too. So I'm not doing anything like imminently, but I'm mulling some options in my brain. How about you?
I am really and remain very happy with my 5-inch apochromatic f6. That is such for me anyway, in my observing style, it's such a like keyhole instrument that I do find myself still using it quite a bit for any kind of deep sky observing. Still with my Takahashi 100 millimeter. If the planets are up and it's a really good night, that's the instrument that gets used for that. In the observatory, one thing I wouldn't mind doing, just to have a little bit more aperture and tracking and a few other things of that nature, would be used Celestron C11. I know a few people that have purchased that and put it on the mount that I have with the refractor on the other side, because you can dual mount it. And that might be something I do in the future. And then I think I would like to get something like somewhere like a 16-inch in the future. And sort of as part of the design of the observatory, it is designed so that I can store a larger instrument up to a certain size. I think a 16-inch should fit. 18-inch might be tight because, as you know, that hilltop is reasonably flat. And I designed it so that the door is right there, and it's hardly much of a step out onto the flat hilltop. So I should be able to keep a big scope in the corner there, a reasonably sized telescope in the corner there, and wheel it out onto the hilltop. That seems like a bit of a stretch at this point, considering where I am, but with the observatory, but we'll see.
Yeah. Cool.
All right. Anything else to add to the show?
No, that's it, Chris.
All right. Well, thanks, Shane. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Please subscribe and do us a favor and share the show with other stargazers you know. And you can always reach us with your show ideas, observations, and questions to actualastronomy@gmail.com.
Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the show. If you are interested in more information, would like to contact us, or if you would like to support the podcast, check out our website, actualastronomy.com.